India played an important role in the multilateral movements of colonies and newly independent countries that developed into the non-aligned movement. Origin of non-alignment movement. Non-alignment had its origins in India's colonial experience and the non-violent Indian independence struggle, which left India determined to be the master of its fate in an international system dominated politically by Cold War alliances and economically by Western capitalism and Soviet communism. The principles of non-alignment, as articulated by Nehru and his successors, were preservation of India's freedom of action internationally through refusal to align India with any bloc or alliance, particularly those led by the United States or the Soviet Union, non-violence and international cooperation as a means of settling international disputes. Non-alignment was a consistent feature of Indian foreign policy by the late 1940s and enjoyed strong, almost unquestioning support among the Indian elite. The term non-alignment was coined by V.K. Menon in his speech at UN in 1953, which was later used by Indian Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru during his speech in 1954 in Colombo, Sri Lanka. In this speech, Nehru described the 5 pillars to be used as a guide for Sino-Indian relations, which were first put forth by Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai, called Panchsheel. These principles would later serve as the basis of the non-aligned movement. Jawaharlal Nehru was the architect of the non-alignment movement. The 5 principles were: mutual respect for each other's territorial integrity and sovereignty, mutual non-aggression, mutual non-interference in domestic affairs, equality and mutual benefit, peaceful coexistence. Jawaharlal Nehru's concept of non-alignment brought India considerable international prestige among newly independent states that shared India's concerns about the military confrontation between the superpowers and the influence of the former colonial powers. New Delhi used non-alignment to establish a significant role for itself as a leader of the newly independent world in such multilateral organizations as the United Nations and the non-aligned movement. The signing of the Treaty of Peace, Friendship, and Cooperation between India and the Soviet Union in 1971 and India's involvement in the internal affairs of its smaller neighbors in the 1970s and 1980s tarnished New Delhi's image as a non-aligned nation and led some observers to note that in practice, non-alignment applied only to India's relations with countries outside South Asia. Early developments. The movement had its origins in the 1947 Asian Relations Meeting in New Delhi and the 1955 Asian-African Conference in Bandung, Indonesia. India also participated in the 1961 Belgrade Conference that officially established the non-aligned movement. But Jawaharlal Nehru's declining prestige limited his influence. In the 1960s and 1970s, New Delhi concentrated on internal problems and bilateral relations, yet retained membership in an increasingly factionalized and radicalized movement. During the contentious 1979 Havana Summit, India worked with moderate nations to reject Cuban President Fidel Castro's proposition that socialism was the natural ally of non-alignment. In 1980s, under Indira Gandhi in the early 1980s, India attempted to reassert its prominent role in the non-aligned movement by focusing on the relationship between disarmament and economic development. By appealing to the economic grievances of developing countries, Indira Gandhi and her successors exercised a moderating influence on the non-aligned movement, diverting it from some of the Cold War issues that marred the controversial 1979 Havana Meeting. Although hosting the 1983 summit at Delhi boosted Indian prestige within the movement, its close relations with the Soviet Union and its pro-Soviet positions on Afghanistan and Cambodia limited its influence. The end of the Cold War left the non-aligned movement without its original raison d'être, and its membership became deeply divided over international disputes, strategy, and organization. During the 1992 Jakarta summit, India took a middle position between countries favoring confrontation with developed nations on international economic issues, such as Malaysia, and those that favored a more cooperative approach, such as Indonesia. Although New Delhi played a minor role compared with Kuala Lumpur and Jakarta on most issues facing the summit, India formulated the non-aligned movement position opposing developed countries' linkage of foreign aid to human rights criteria. Consequences: the early 1990s demise of the bipolar world system, which had existed since the end of World War II, shook the underpinnings of India's foreign policy. The Cold War system of alliances had been rendered meaningless by the collapse of the East European communist states, the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact, and the demise of the Soviet Union. In the early 1990s, most colonies had become independent, and apartheid in South Africa was being dismantled, diminishing the value of anti-colonialism and making it impossible for anti-racism to serve as a rallying point for international political action. The Panchsheel, peaceful resolution of international disputes, and international cooperation to spur economic development, which was being enhanced by domestic economic reforms, were broad objectives in a changing world. Thus, the 1990s saw India redefining non-alignment and the view of India's place in the world. India also is a founding member of the Group of 15, a group of developing nations established at the 9th Non-Aligned Movement Summit in Belgrade in 1989 to facilitate dialogue with the industrialized countries. India played host to the 4th Group of 15 summit in March 1994. At the summit, Prime Minister Narasimha Rao and other leaders expressed concern over new trade barriers being raised by the industrialized countries despite the conclusion of a new World Trade Agreement.